My guest today is the one and the only and the amazing Luke Storey. And our title today is Riding the Dragon of Life, because Luke's life is definitely a dragon ride with some real challenges and challenging lows and some really cool highs that he's going to share about. I had the great fortune of meeting Luke at his beautiful home in Austin, Texas. Today, we're going to get into Luke's life story. So, Luke, it's just a pleasure to have you here.
I'm excited to do this. It's been a long time coming.
Yes, it has. And I hope it's the beginning of many more. So, to begin with, you've lived a very potent life with some real challenges, but some real successes as well. Two of the initial challenges of your life struck close to home with me as a man who endured a lot of violence in childhood, with a brother that was a drug addict starting in the 7th grade and then later committed suicide. You shared with me that you'd become a drug addict as a young kid, 9 or 10 years old, I believe you said, because of sexual abuse, alcoholism in the family, etc. And as I said, when I look through your kind of biographical outline that you shared with me, I resonated with it a lot. And I've been, as you know, a therapist for 40 plus years. So I've been through the lives of a lot of people. And I don't think a lot of people realize how common these kinds of challenges are in families. So I not only want to hear about your childhood and the things that are inherent to that stage of your life, but I'd love it if insights rise up in you as to what you think parents need to be more aware of to prevent, drug addiction in children or addiction period. And, the kinds of things that seem to happen reflexively in families. But if parents were a little more conscious of the outcome and the long-term consequences, might breathe into these things a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of my parents, what they didn't know, they didn't know.
Yeah.
And we're certainly at that time, I mean, they've both done a lot of work on themselves, thankfully, which has been part of the reason that I've been inspired to do so myself. But it's that pain begets pain, right?
Yeah.
My parents were products of a lineage of dysfunctional people and, as you said, alcoholism and things like that. And so they divorced when I was about 3, and my mom was, a liberal from Berkeley, and my dad was a conservative from Colorado.
That's a kind of a contrast.
Which is wild that they ever got together, and no surprise that they didn't last. But I think the lack of a father figure in the home, which may have been, a benefit for where he was in his life. He had a lot of anger issues and things like that when he was younger. But I think part of the thing that made me susceptible to predation was the sixth sense that predators have when there's a vulnerable prey. And so part of why I think that particular situation happened was because it was clear to the predator that there was no protective male figure present,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a really important thing. And
Yes.
then, I've looked at this from all different angles, right? And especially as it led so perfectly into early addiction, quite younger than most people do, was not even so much the event itself in terms of the abuse, which of course was catastrophic for a number of reasons we can discuss, but it was the aftermath of that and not having the appropriate venue by which to share what was going on, what had happened, right? It was holding the experience was probably more harmful than the experience itself because there was no way to contextualize it. And I like to say it was the loss of inner sense, right? As my persona and ego and all of the things that make one an individual was in the process of taking shape, there was such a massive interruption.
Yeah, it's something that a child's mind, I think, inherently senses is wrong, but doesn't know how to categorize it, how to give it context, because there's not enough life experience in a child to really know anything other than their raw feelings.
Exactly.
I think a child knows when it's being invaded, for sure.
Well, it's interesting. I've looked at this, as I said, from so many different angles in my process over the past almost 30 years of healing after getting sober when I was in my late 20s. And, in terms of parents, I mean, my parents ultimately were the greatest teachers I could have ever had and continue to be. But one of the things that I think was maybe just missing from the culture at that time, we're talking 1976, was I don't think many parents were even aware that these kind of things could potentially happen. So there were never conversations like, hey, no one should ever touch you in the following ways.
Right.
And if this ever happens, I want you to know that that there's a safe place for you to bring that, right?
Right.
So in the grooming process, there was sort of an escalation of secrecy where I would be allowed to do certain things that I knew were against the rules. And there was kind of a testing period with the particular abuser wherein he could see that I was willing to withhold these things from my mom. Right? It's like, oh, I'll let you stay up later. And then I didn't say anything about that. It's our little secret kind of thing, which is a classic grooming tactic, and then escalated to, letting me look at dirty magazines and don't say anything. And then I didn't say anything. And so there was like this relationship of secrecy that took place, which, not only vetted me as a perfect victim, but also set the stage for my inability to share what was happening with my family and with my parents, because then there would be an admission of guilt to the things that I wasn't supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So it created this real
Mexican finger trap.
isolation, within myself. And that's, so clear to me now when I discovered that you could alter your consciousness with drugs. It was like, saved my life. I mean, as problematic as addiction ended up being for me, I'm actually very grateful that I lived in Northern California in the 70s as a kid and into the 80s. And, the socioeconomic kind of climate in which I grew up and the prevalence of drugs everywhere was really probably a life-saving measure because I had nowhere else to take that. And then, those coping mechanisms to feel a sense of connection and safety within myself. Obviously, there's a point at which that turns against you. And that happened, pretty soon. But still, there was like, I needed that warm blanket of safety, and I didn't know how to get it from people.
Yeah.
And so I sought that out through substances.
It's amazing, too, that the drugs didn't loosen you up enough to start talking about that with other people, maybe doing drugs with you. For example, LSD, one of the things Albert Hoffman thought it could be used for was a truth serum. He gave it to, I think, the Pentagon, but it ended up in the hands of the U.S. Army. And so they put a team of Green Berets into an LSD journey. And the conclusion was every one of them wanted out of the military because they realized they didn't want to kill anybody anymore.
Yeah.
And that was one of the governmental reasons for getting it off the streets, because they knew that it basically abolished the ego, and they couldn't have soldiers not wanting to battle.
You don't want a bunch of pacifist soldiers.
Yeah. So, but the point I'm bringing up is that the number of people that have these kinds of things, but even in deep ceremonies, often don't share them. Now, sometimes they do, because I've had that happen many times in my career as a therapist, but I'm just amazed that for all the times you were doing drugs, that didn't just percolate out of you, because it's such a pressure in the unconscious. It's like, it's like welling up, and they're like a volcano ready to go at some point.
That has been the case as I've worked with medicines in my sobriety, right? Building the capacity for intimacy. I mean, these are things that I'd shared with people prior to that when I was sent to the boarding school when I was a kid. But I think why a lot of that didn't come out as a result of that was going back to the secrecy, right? This pattern of secrecy and loneliness and isolation. It's like what had happened was under the guise of secrecy, and I couldn't tell anyone about that. And then the coping mechanism of using drugs that I started to apply to just be able to live in my body also had to be kept in secret.
Right.
And so there was a lot of, I spent a lot of time alone when I was a kid, both in a physical sense, but also just within myself. I was very lost within myself. And drugs aided in that. So rather than like drawing me closer in the sense of a ceremony or community or the kind of healthy intimacy that can be created within that context, it had the opposite effect of separating me, especially because I was doing drugs at such a young age. There were no peers with which I could relate on that level because most of the kids my age weren't doing drugs like I was doing them, you know?
Right.
And so, a lot of the, companions that I developed in those years were older kids. And there was, these were not reciprocal relationships. They were, when you get two addicts kind of living in an animal survival state, regardless of age, it's a world of takers.
Yes.
Right. So it's like people have this sort of rapacious relationship with the world and with other people. So there wasn't, even though my defenses might have been down at certain points, there was no safety created in those relationships because you couldn't trust anyone.
Yeah.
And I had very little trust in people anyway because of the ways in which my trust had been violated.
Yeah. It's a tough thing to have happen in critical growth and developmental years because it can really alter the framework of perception of the world. It's great that you were able to heal and to come out of that progressively over time. But when people are in these traumatic experiences during key developmental stages, such as the brain's growth and expansion and interconnection, without going through all the stages of the brain, but it's not unusual for a person to be stuck at a developmental level where a trauma like that happens. And then they end up in an adult body, but can't figure out why their life's always trouble, because they're still stuck there.
Yeah.
So there's really a broken child in an adult body. And that often leads to people living on the street and not being able to hold jobs and not being able to hold responsibility in marriages and all sorts of stuff, and most people, like with these types of challenges, develop very effective coping strategies, but once someone gets into an intimate relationship or a long-term friendship, then the people start to see, okay, there's something off, it might be an inability to be reliable with responsibility. Like, how come this guy always says he's going to meet us and never shows up? Or, just things like that. But it's just good that you managed to navigate the world without it. My brother was, as I mentioned to you, was a drug addict, and he had some real challenges and a lot of anger issues, and it really screwed his life up on many, many levels. And even intimate personal relationships got very broken. And, it seemed that the only people that he could be with were people just like him, which is, he ended up joining the Hells Angels. But, you get these collections of people that migrate together, but they're really sort of all dealing with similar challenges. And somehow they manage to work things out amongst them, kind of like people in prison, which, whether that's working it out or not, I don't know. But it's just amazing how we are pulled into these different streams of life due to the traumas we have or due to the parental upbringing we have.
Yeah. When I look back on that, I can see now that I would meet whatever level of consciousness was most fitting.
Yes.
Right. So thinking back, I just used to hang around people that, to say the least, lacked integrity, to put it mildly. And that's because I did too. It was totally normal when I was a kid to break into people's houses and steal their stuff and steal from my parents and just live a complete lie and, violate other people's boundaries in that sense. And having zero moral aptitude.
Yeah.
Right. And so the people that I surrounded myself with were also like that. And it makes sense that your brother ended up with the Hells Angels, right? It's like, you're going to find your tribe, however much it hurts to do so. And, when you're in a den of thieves and no one can trust one another, that just becomes the norm.
Yeah.
But it's been interesting to see in the years that I've been working on myself in various ways, my discernment has been directly proportional to my own level of integrity and my own consciousness. Like the things that I won't let myself get away with, I won't let the people in my life get away with either.
Right.
So the road has truly gotten so much more narrow in a sense, but it's also simplified, and year over year there's less drama because there's less drama within me. So I'm not willing to tolerate any chaos or shenanigans from the people in my life.
Yes.
So things get much cleaner over time. But, looking back on that time, it's like my life was just complete chaos. It's funny too. I actually see sometimes my wife is you met Allison, she's really just such a wise soul. And something that we've been observing lately is how sometimes I'll create just busyness and chaos. I mean, nothing destructive, just all productive, working on business, just filling my plate with so many different projects and things like that. And we've kind of been looking at that and seeing that there was so much chaos in my childhood. Even though everything I'm doing now on paper is healthy, sometimes I'll fill my plate so much because I'm actually just not used to the spaciousness.
Yes.
Right. To create space and stillness and quiet. And, I've been meditating for 28 years in a very committed way. Yet still, I'll find myself just creating, my own little microcosm of chaos on a day-to-day basis. It's been really interesting to kind of go back and observe, to your point, of how, our personalities are kind of being shaped during that time. And if there's such a dramatic interruption in that, there really is for lack of a better term, a retardation, right, of those developmental years, where if you're growing up, on an ashram, you're going to have a totally different way to associate your life and how to build a life. And it's going to be filled with much more spaciousness and stillness. And that's what will be comfortable because the template is set for that.
Yeah, I think because in our developmental years, the environment sets what I would call our resonant frequency. So if you're in a chaotic environment or an unstable environment, then if you think of the soul as an analogy as water, if the environment's boiling, then our sense of normal is a boil.
Totally.
And I've worked with countless X Games athletes and, superstar motocross racers and, skateboarders and, adrenaline junkies. But I've seen a pattern in working with so many of them and helping them with relationship crisis. And what you find is that they can't often handle quiet. They can't handle, it actually makes them nervous if an environment becomes too peaceful. They literally don't know what to do with themselves. So they'll start an argument and oftentimes I have to work with them to show them, because many of these guys are very, very successful. And I've worked with women too in this category, but it's mostly men. And of course, they usually attract very, very beautiful women because they're all super successful alpha male types. And so, but the women are often, much more stable inside. And they don't realize that this constant need to keep everything sort of the fire burning. And I don't mean the hearth fire. I mean the fire of that brings them into that sense of their normal developmental state, which from their childhood, they don't realize that they're actually putting their relationships under tremendous stress, and they're actually imprinting their children with that same need to buzz all the time. For me, working with lots of them, it's been quite a journey, and I've found for years I used medical qigong and then the work in exercises I developed and Tai Chi. And the ones that I could get to commit to it for at least 100-day gong, I could watch them softening and watch them calming down and watch their need for constant use of marijuana and stimulants like Monster and Red Bull. That's the other thing. These guys are constantly jacked to the nines, but they're constantly drinking all this stimulating stuff, and they'll be drinking this stuff all day long, right till before bed.
And then going, I can't figure out why I have so much anxiety.
Yeah, and, it's just like it's an interesting thing. Some of us, until we get into the inner work, inner arts, and really learn how to take the witness position and look at ourselves more objectively, like to say, okay, let me just be honest and observe what I'm seeing, as opposed to it's always somebody else's fault. Once I can get a person to that state, then they start actually seeing their own story more clearly. And then they can, start becoming a co-author of a better story, which is why I put so much effort into the study of and application of myth in my career, because, we're all living our own myth. But if you don't realize that, then you're living someone else's story until you have enough consciousness to take authorship and then really say, okay, I don't have to keep going through divorces. I don't have to keep having burned relationships. I don't have to keep losing sponsors or whatever it turns out to be. I can actually improve my relationship with myself. And I think once a person starts improving their relationship with herself, then their field of perception changes. It's like the mirror gets cleaner and cleaner. And then their whole outer world starts to appear different. They attract different people and different circumstances into their life, which I think is why healing work is so critical.
You just gave me a really interesting insight that I never put together before in terms of developing the witness observer perspective, right? Of practicing meditation so that you develop that relationship between you, the persona, you, the mind, you, the ego, and then who's the one watching, right? It begs the question, okay, if I'm watching my thoughts, there's a consciousness or a soul part of me that's watching the thoughts. I actually just now made the correlation now between so much of the emphasis in the 12 steps, which is like just the foundation of everything that makes me good in life. There's so much emphasis in self-honesty and personal inventory of really, getting down to the nitty-gritty of what motivates you and how your instincts drive you, and how you create chaos in your life and the lives of those around you, and your character defects and your shortcomings and all these things. I actually never put it together that process is really a process of developing the witness, right? Because the witness is honest. It's that part of you that's able to see the shenanigans that you're up to that the conscious mind won't let you see, because the conscious mind is part of that pattern making, right? So it's a really interesting correlation.
If you have listened to even one episode of Paul's podcast before, then you will know that he is passionate, and some would say even fanatical, about the quality of the food he eats and where it is sourced from. That is why the Chek household only eats pasture-raised meat, wild-caught fish, and organic produce. And that is why we subscribe to Wild Pastures meat delivery service. Each month, Wild Pastures delivers a box of meat that has been raised by family farmers in the USA using regenerative farming practices. 100% grass-fed and finished beef, pasture-raised chicken, and pasture-raised pork, as well as wild-caught seafood. You can customize the selection in your box, add on extra when you know you will be feeding more people, or change your options each and every month. You might be thinking that this will be too expensive for you, but Wild Pasture's mission is to offer the highest quality meat at the lowest prices, because they want to transform the meat industry. And that means that more people need to be able to choose meat that is raised right. Their pasture-raised animals are part of a natural ecosystem. Their farmers use rotational grazing, practices that mimic nature, and so do not need to use synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, hormones, or antibiotics. This beautiful process doesn't require the external resources, such as massive amounts of GMO grain, required with environmentally depleting conventional methods. And best of all, the meat and fish taste amazing. And for Paul's listeners, Wild Pastures are offering you 20% off your subscription for life, $15 off your first order, and free shipping. Seriously, you can't find a better deal for top quality pasture-raised meat. go to wildpastures.com/Paul Chek. You don't need a promo code. Just visit wildpastures.com/Paul Chek and start choosing the goodies you will have delivered to you in your first box.
Well, in my teachings in Spirit Gym, and I learned this from the study of Plotinus, who's got a lot to say about the soul and very deep and profound teachings on the soul. But Plotinus says the soul has three qualities: to abide, which is the witness, which is really God, because only God can create a soul, and God's the unmoved mover, the way, woo, way, the witness of its own story, which is all of us. And then to reflect, which is memory, because without memory, the soul would have no awareness of itself, and to represent itself. So what we're talking about here as the witness is actually the ability to reflect, but not be attached. So the detachment, because if you're attached, then you can't reflect. You're in it. You're like someone who's caught in their trauma. When I'm training therapists, for example, I have to teach them, look, you have to learn to have healthy empathy, but with a healthy level of detachment. Because the urge of a lot of therapists when someone's going through an emotional catharsis as part of a healing is to get so caught up in it that they actually end up going down the river with this person. And then I have to say, look, right now you're losing your agency because you're the one that's got to maintain the witness position and hold a stable space for the person. But if you're down there on the floor crying with them and you're caught up in the catharsis of feeling so much of their pain that you've actually lost awareness that you're supposed to be holding the field, then you're really not doing effective therapy. I tell people misery loves company, but you got to be careful not to keep company for misery, or misery stays around.
You just described, by the way, the primary tool I use in my relationship, to really be supportive of my wife, because I have such high empathy and, experienced a fair amount of emotional incest when I was a kid, for lack of a better term. So I really am prone to feeling other people's feelings and getting sucked into them, as you described.
Yeah.
And one of the best practices for me, to this day, it happens all the time, is to be able to be present for, just call it the feminine storm.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Provided it's expressed in a healthy way, which in my case it is, thankfully. Took me a long time to get there, to be able to gravitate, a partner that was willing to have that capacity. But it's actually such a powerful, energetic, healing container for me to be able to have that empathy, but not sink too deeply into it, where my feminine energies start to coalesce.
Yes.
And then there's no structure to allow for the expression. All that needs to happen is some energy just needs to be moved.
Yes.
And if I get involved in the movement of the energy, we're both lost in the energy, and we don't get anywhere,
Yeah, I think it's fine to help direct the energy to the degree you can, particularly with a woman, without her feeling as though you're trying to fix her, because that gets a backlash.
Won't go well.
No. But like if I'm dealing with a circumstance like that, I try to look for the deeper storyline, like what's really wanting to be said. I think, I read a great book I think you'd love. It's called Sacred Listening by Kay Lindahl, and I made it part of my training for my higher level practitioners and use it in throughout my career. I think with sacred listening, and having studied nonviolent communication, one of the things that really came out of that study for me was there's a difference between the words a person's using, or even the emotions that they're expressing, such as tears, anger, frustration, jealousy, anger, and what they're really trying to say. And so as a therapist, I was inspired by Kay Lindahl's book to create space in myself to go deeper than the words and the surface expression, and see if I could listen at the soul level and see, what is this person truly wanting, feeling, or needing? Because oftentimes the more trauma there is, the more jumbled the story gets, and certain parts of it get magnified and then re-magnified. And a person can get caught in a victim mentality. So the next thing you know, the story is really like, you have all sorts of Dungeons and Dragons and things.
And obscured by projection.
Yes, and
Right.
and the victim archetype
Yeah.
also really loves to draw people into the story, but just really being present with. And what I do is I empty myself and become like a drum skin, and I listen to the words with one ear, but I feel what's happening inside of my inner self. So if, for example, my heart starts to really constrict, I know I'm not constricting my own heart. So they might be talking about how upset they were that so-and-so said something about them. But then when I feel that constriction in the heart, don't know I'm doing this, but while I'm listening to them, I'm connecting to their soul and saying, I'm feeling my heart constrict. What is it that's happening inside of you that I need to know that's making my heart feel so constricted? And their soul will tell me, ask them about this. And the point I'm making is, if I didn't use that listening ability, then all I would have as a therapist to go on is what's bubbling up on the surface. And there's often so many layers of armoring and defense and distraction, because oftentimes they're afraid to go to that place inside of themselves, because a wound like a sexual wound can be so painful, especially if it's from your own father or mother. It can be so painful that they can't take just the thought of it's more than they can handle. What I wanted to point out was that the three functions of the soul is to abide, which is the witness, to reflect, which is our memory, and to represent. So when we're witnessing, like we were just talking about, you're witnessing and you're hearing your own story and you're observing your own story, and it might contain things like you said, I used to break into people's houses and do all these things, but now you can represent yourself. You can say, okay, well, who do I choose to be now? And this is why I always say, what is your dream? And then we can actually consciously say, well, I'm going to choose to be this way. And the next time so-and-so triggers me in this way, instead of reacting violently or criticizing, I'm going to give them permission to be just exactly who they are, but I'm going to maintain my sense of composure so that I don't fall back into the old story again. And it takes practice to do that. But I think ultimately that's the basis of psychological growth. Without that, I don't think we ever grow. I think we just have the same story running in our head. And no matter how old we are, it's just the same person looking through the eyes of an older body.
Yeah. Yep. That's been my experience.
Well, you had some experience with a cult, and that you were sent to a cult-like troubled teen wilderness school, which touched me quite a lot, because I too found myself kicked out of 2 public schools and had nowhere to go. So my mother sent me away to a Seventh-day Adventist private school, which was very cult-like. And you were there for 2 years after being arrested for robbing a house at age 14. I'd love it if you could share the experience. And I'd like to dialogue with you on the issues of cults today, because I think cults are a bigger problem than most people realize. And there's a book I'd like to recommend for the listeners. I don't know if you're aware of it, Luke. It's called Freedom of Mind, Helping Loved Ones Leave Controlling People, Cults, and Beliefs by Stephen Hassan, PhD. And I've watched a very good interview with him, and I like, okay, this guy's the real deal. But I'd love to hear about that experience and just that stage of your life, and what was it that now leaves you aware that you were in a cult type situation?
Well, I think one of the things that's indicative of cult indoctrination is that you often don't realize you're in one until you leave.
Yes,
You know?
that's the problem.
Yeah, that's the sticking point there. So when I was 14, both my parents had just kind of reached their wits' end, and it was I was unmanageable. And so I'll never forget, I was in the courthouse with a judge in a little court in Aspen, Colorado, in Pitkin County, where I was arrested. And when I got arrested for that robbery, I was put on probation because I was 14. It was my first offense, and then I immediately broke probation. The judge found out about it because it's a small town, and we're sitting there with the judge, and he just told my dad. He said, "You've got two choices. You get this kid out of the state of Colorado, or you leave him here, and one more infraction is going to send him to the juvenile detention center until he's 18." And thankfully, my dad had the resources and the wherewithal to speedily find me a place to go. But this is in the early 80s, and so the troubled teen industry was kind of this emerging moneymaker, and there was a lot of cowboys and Indians out there trying to figure out what to do with these troubled kids. And so there was a place in Provo, Utah that was like a locked facility, and then there were a couple other ones around the country. There's actually one here in San Bernardino County called CEDU, CEDU. And so I was sent to the sister property called Rocky Mountain Academy up in northern Idaho, almost in Canada. And so at the time, it was terrifying, and there was a real sense of abandonment, right? Because my parents are dropping me off there, and it's like, not that I had a real sense of safety with either of my parents, but it was certainly safer than getting dropped off at some camp in the middle of the woods. And it wasn't a locked facility, which made it a little more palatable, but because of where it was situated, it was so remote that even if you tried to run away, you wouldn't get very far because they would send these bounty hunters after you. And so I learned quickly that even though there were no gates and bars or anything like that, that there was nowhere to go.
Right.
And so I thankfully submitted myself to the program in a way that a lot of kids had a hard time with. Kids would continue to rebel or try to run away, and if you ran away, you'd get sent to one of the locked facilities. So I just kind of went with the program and had no idea, of course, at that age, how inappropriate some of their methods of therapy and rehabilitation were, in the sense of, there's a lot of history to this, which I learned way later in life, but the CEDU school from which this particular school evolved had originally been part of a truly legitimate and quite dangerous cult called Synanon, which was created by a megomaniacal cult leader who had defected from Alcoholics Anonymous and created this Synanon organization as a way to rehab drug addicts and alcoholics. And so a lot of the therapeutic models that were applied in the school were born out of that original cult. And a lot of it had to do with group therapy that involved a lot of intimidation and screaming and peer shaming and just the stories I could tell, man, just weird shit. Sleep deprivation. There were these workshops they called profits, and
sounds like Est or I wish I could remember the name of it. You'd know what it is, but
a lot of the things that they were applying there in terms of therapy were kind of experimental pop psychology, things, kind of artifacts of, kind of the liberation of the 70s and going into the 80s. And so there were wilderness excursions where you'd be thrown out in the woods for 3 days by yourself on what they called a solo, which from one lens, depending on perspective, could be looked at as a beautiful vision quest and an opportunity to build self-esteem and a rite of passage and things like that. So everything within that experience really was a double-edged sword, depending on perspective. One could also say taking a 14-year-old kid in a 60-pound backpack and throwing him out in the middle of the mountains to build a snow cave, alone for 3 days could be a kind of torture.
Well, yeah, it could get him killed.
Yeah. So there were, just all sorts of different things like that, that again, later I identified as very culty. We had our own language, our own vocabulary. A lot of the punishments involved isolation, where you would be essentially shunned, and they had their own terminology for that. Your parents weren't allowed to visit for the first year or so you're there. You couldn't even talk to your parents.
Wow.
You couldn't talk to anyone from the outside world.
That's pretty unusual.
You couldn't leave. So there were a lot of things like that. But what's interesting about it is that the core tenets and principles that they were teaching were essentially spiritual principles and, understanding just fundamental things like honesty and loyalty and love. And, there's some kind of hippy dippy stuff that was infused there in terms of the music. We weren't allowed to listen to secular music like rock and roll. We could only listen to, I don't know, what would now be considered new age music or something like that. No electric guitars, and we had to cut our hair short. You couldn't wear shirts with any kind of logo. In other words, they stripped away any false persona you had in order to build a new one.
That's the build a new one's the concerning part.
Yeah, which is very culty. But interestingly enough, even though after I left that school, I did quite quickly get back into drugs, they instilled in me enough, as twisted as it was, the way they did it, they instilled in me enough morality that from that moment on, I never stole from anyone or did anything to knowingly harm anyone, so I didn't, despite, getting really deeply addicted to all kinds of nasty drugs, I managed to stay out of trouble with the law because I wasn't doing anything illegal other than dealing drugs, from 16 to 26 when I got sober. But I didn't know it was a cult until a few years ago. I started looking into the idea of writing a book. And so I thought, well, let me look into some of my past experiences and see what I can extract from there in terms of wisdom or experience. So I went on Facebook and I looked up Rocky Mountain Academy alumni, thinking I might find some of the students that I was there with. And all I found were like Rocky Mountain Academy survivors.
Wow.
These I was the only one that kind of didn't know that it was a cult. And most people didn't consider themselves graduates or alumni, but rather survivors and had been quite traumatized by the experience. So it's interesting that one can have an experience that's viewed as abuse from one lens, while my experience, being ignorant of some of the abusive elements of it, it really saved my life. And to this day, I don't think I would change anything, because where I would have been had I not been there and had a major pattern interrupter is absolutely for sure within the prison system.
Yeah.
And so it was, it was a gift, but also came with its own set of challenges and reintegrate. And another thing about leaving a cult, anyone that's had the experience will know, the reintegration into society and trying to fit in and be quote unquote normal is very difficult, which is one of the reasons I went immediately back into drug abuse, because how could I contextualize the life that I had led there and explain the things that I had learned about myself, the things that I had been through. There's no way in a small town in Colorado where I was sent back to high school after leaving there. You had, the jocks and the stoners. And so was I gonna go back with the jocks and the preppies? This is in the 80s. This is how you classify people. So I immediately fell in with the outcasts because they were all the other misunderstood kids.
Right.
And they were the only ones that could even remotely understand maybe what I had been through, or the fact that I was trying to reintegrate into this society, having no social skills that were relevant to mainstream society. My social skills were built on all of these dubious practices from that school.
Yeah. I think, there's a lot we could go into with the whole cult thing, but I think one of the things I would encourage everyone, including parents, to be aware of, even if you're in a situation where you have a very violent child or a child that's uncontrollable. But I think the thing that I think is important is that if you put your child somewhere where they're instilling a belief system, then they're taking away the capacity for one's ability to discern whether or not they want to believe a certain ideology or ism, and they're becoming indoctrinated. And I think once a person's indoctrinated into a belief system, and a lot of these types of schools are based on religious ideology. And I saw, fortunately for me, because my mother became a yogi when I was 12, by the time I got sent away to the Seventh-day Adventist school, I had two frames of reference. I had my mother's early years in Christian Science, which was also had some cult-like orientation to it. But then the Self-Realization Fellowship gave me a really good baseline measure of what a healthy, psychologically healthy person is, because the monks were so amazingly stable and present. So by the time I ended up in the Seventh-day Adventist school and was just getting this hardcore Christian hell and damnation, spare the rod, spoil the child, and they would whip you with yardsticks and all sorts of stuff in there. And because I had a reference point, I could say you can have all that hell and damnation stuff. I got enough of that from Christian Science, and I have a deep enough sense of God in me now that that stuff, I just ignored it. But I saw how hook, line, and sinker so many of these kids were, and just like robotic, and stopping everything to pray multiple times a day. And, no one's allowed to have rock music. And a lot of the things you were talking about, a lot of the same things you're talking about was right there in that school.
Did you guys have to part your hair on the side?
Well, we had to have...
We couldn't part our hair in the middle.
Yeah, I can't remember at that time how there was with hair. I know in the Seventh-day Adventist school, they had a lot of rules and regulations on hair and clothing, and similar to what you described. But I think the point I'm trying to drive for parents is you just need to be conscious that if where you're sending your child includes indoctrination into a belief system, but doesn't give them the freedom to compare or to choose or to ask, is it for me? And also, I was a paratrooper, so I went through military training, and that's all about indoctrination and, getting rid of the old you to build the new you, so you'll kill a commie for mommy and not ask questions. And so by the time I got to the military, and having been through Seventh-day Adventist school and all these things that I've been through, I looked at the military and I'm like, oh my God, here we go again. Well, I got lots to ignore here today, but I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on what you'd like to share just to help parents realize, that you need to be discerning about where you put your child, even if your child's driving you absolutely loopy and you need to do something?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, in the years since I had that experience, many of these institutions have been exposed for there are cases where there was much more outright abuse than what I experienced at the school that I attended. So I think now there's much more public awareness, but there are also a lot of legal loopholes, and there are waivers and things that parents sign that relinquish their rights. So I think, in terms of protecting a kid from harm, due diligence and research is really, really important. And also being mindful of what documentations are being signed in terms of jurisdiction over your kid.
And fine print.
Yeah, exactly. The legal liability and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to think there are schools of that nature that take kids and really nurture them and care for them in a way that is helpful and not harmful. But I mean, there's documentaries on TV now about these schools, and it's something that's kind of been whistleblown, so to speak. So I think at the time when I was going to these schools, obviously we didn't have the internet or social media. And so you would have, someone in intake at the school answer the phone and say, oh, that's what's going on with your kid. Oh yeah, we can help them. And these are quite expensive schools too. I don't remember what it was, but thankfully my dad was able to afford it. I mean, he really saved my life. I'm always so grateful despite some of the strange things that happen there. But yeah, the deep research and due diligence is really important, because you really, if you can't handle your kid's behavior and you have the need to send them off for someone else to handle it, I mean, it's really important that it's done so with the utmost care and professionalism, and also transparency. I mean, that was one of the things in my school. My parents had no idea what was going on there.
Yeah, that's scary.
Because of the way that it was set up, that you were cut off from communication for quite a long time. And so by the time you were indoctrinated into their methodology and their kind of loose belief system, for lack of a better term, the parents would have had no choice to intervene at that point, because it's kind of too late. They would have had to pull you out of the school and repair whatever damage had been done. In my case, I mean, I was absolutely brainwashed, but the brainwashing that I received was necessary. And it was still an improvement over what I walked in with.
Yeah.
Right? There was still a sense of safety. And, I met an adult there. I think he was the superintendent, this man, Tim Brace. And he's really the first adult I ever trusted in my life. And he was a loving and kind man, and treated me fairly, and earned my trust and deserved my trust. And there was never any funny business there. So I really benefited in that way. But many other kids had a different experience, probably because their parents blindly just kind of threw up their hands like mine did and said, well, he's going to get in worse trouble here, so we're going to just take a chance on this. But luckily, I think for me, that school also didn't really have any religious affiliation. So
That's really good.
yeah, it was a lot of this pop psychology stuff. So when it came time for me to be faced with find a spiritual path or die, I didn't have a lot of dogma that I needed to work through and discard. I was quite open because there wasn't a full bucket of knowledge that I needed to put aside, and I was very, receptive to ideas like prayer and meditation, things that I learned when I checked myself into rehab at 26. I didn't have to undo, bad experiences in Catholic Church or any of the things that many people do, or the religious school that you were in. I didn't have any of that, so it worked in my favor. So I'm thankful for that there wasn't, a real theology behind what they were doing. It was kind of just, all of this experimental pop therapy stuff.
Well, you just reminded me of something I think is very interesting. I was sent to this school, and it was supposed to be great for kids that were, having a hard time, and it was a private school, but it was hardcore Seventh-day Adventist. It was all like just an extension of their religion. It would be like going to church all day long, 7 days a week, is what it was like.
Right.
But I grew up, on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, in a logging town where there's just lots of drugs and lots of violence and fighting and ass kickers and, you name it. It's the wild, wild west out there. And I grew up with a lot of crazy friends that were just off the rails all the time. And so my parents were sending me to this school because one of the reasons was they wanted to get me away from the drugs and the violence that was in public school. I was blown away. I have never in my life, well, at least up to that point, seen so much sex, so much pornography, so much drugs. I mean, on the surface, these kids had mastered the disguise. They would show up to pray. They would have their little pretty suits and gowns on. And I realized that what had happened is these kids had been raised in this heavy religious environment, but they have friends that are not in it. And so they had learned how to work the game. And, there was a curfew there, and it was lights out by, I think, 10 o'clock or 9:30, but that's when the show began.
Of course.
I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And I used to just be amazed, like the amount of drugs going around that place. And like, you could get anything you wanted if you just knew who to talk to. And so I used to remember thinking to myself, these parents are absolutely, utterly clueless as to what their children are actually doing. But the key point I'm bringing up, because our next topic is parenting, is that I saw that these kids had become masters of the disguise. They knew just how to talk to their parents, just how to talk to the teachers, just how to create the illusion that they were exactly how the teachers and parents wanted them to. But once they got behind closed doors, man, let's just say a lot of devil showed up. And I'm talking about going out at night, stealing shit, buying stuff that wasn't supposed to be on campus, and I could tell you many stories of the shit that I not only saw but participated in. And I remember thinking, God, my mother hasn't got a clue what she sent me to. Neither does any of these kids' parents.
Yeah.
I'm like, if you want to go to a fine school for how to get yourself in a lot of trouble, it's hiding right here.
Well, the holiday season is already upon us, and I don't know about you, but I'm already feeling a little bit overwhelmed. With all the demands of the end-of-year tasks for the businesses, holiday preparations, gift shopping, and all the family get-togethers, it can all be a little bit too much and a big source of stress. Well, that's why I'm here to tell you about Stress Guardian, because this is the latest scientific breakthrough from Bioptimizers, which, as you know, if you're a regular listener of Paul's podcast, is the company that makes some of his favorite and must-have supplements. Stress Guardian is packed with a blend of 14 adaptogenic herbs to help you regulate your stress response naturally, and so giving you some more control over your holiday stress. With daily use, Stress Guardian becomes your personal shield against seasonal tension, enhancing both your mental and physical well-being. So say goodbye to just surviving and this holiday season thrive with Stress Guardian. To get a head start on reducing your holiday stress, visit bioptimizers.com/living4D and use the promo code PAUL10 for 10% off your first order. That's bioptimizers.com/living4D and the promo code is PAUL10. By the way, Bioptimizers is so confident in their products that they offer a risk-free 365-day money-back guarantee. So you absolutely can't go wrong. And I highly recommend that you try Stress Guardian today.
The next one I wanted to talk to you is about parenting. It's apparent to me that today more than ever, we're having a crisis of parenting. Leonard Sachs, MD, has several excellent books and audiobooks on the issues of young boys and girls and parenting today. And I must say that what he unravels is shocking. Have you looked at any of his work at all?
No, I haven't.
Oh my God, check it out. He's got great audiobooks and books, and he tells you what's really going on and just cites tons of research on the status of children from all the way from, like first grade or younger right through university. And so without a long to do, he really shows you the crisis that we're in right now. He's speaking largely of the United States, but he does talk about various international things. And so, as a therapist and as a parent, that concerns me deeply because the children are our future, right? If you want to know what's going to happen in 10 years, just look at what's going on with the children that are in high school right now, and you'll see what your future looks like. Anyhow, as we all know, the environment since the pandemic has really created a problem. I've seen numerous studies now that have come out of major universities showing that kids that are in the stages of either, from birth all the way through to teenage years have now suffered a developmental delay that many psychologists and university researchers say will not be fixable. They've got what they classify as a permanent developmental delay from COVID and the lockdowns, and being forced to go to school on computers and having to wear masks, and children that cannot see facial expression, which is essential to their psychological development. So there's a couple things I'd like to hear your thoughts on, not only because I think you understand all these things, but because you and I both come from troubled households. What do you think's led to this crisis in parenting? And when and if you feel parenting was more favorable for children in the past, do you think
Yeah, well, I'll preface that by just stating out the gate that I'm not yet a parent. I can only speak to it from having had parents. But what I can say in terms of all of my interpersonal relationships and looking at those in my lineage, that the further I've gone in my willingness to heal my core wounds and to address things in my past, the further I've gone has increased my capacity for healthy, unconditional love and intimacy.
Yeah.
And there's a contagious nature to trauma, right? And everyone's had some degree of trauma. You might have had the perfect childhood, but you were in a motorcycle accident when you were 10 years old and almost died, right? It comes in all different flavors, as you know. But in observing my life and the quality of my relationships, I can only imagine what a better parent I would be now as a result of the work that I put in. And I do have a kind of a secondary observation in my younger brother, Cody, who was also, went down the path that I did in terms of addiction, and the way that he processed the issues of his childhood was the way that I did. Thankfully, he got sober many, many years ago. And now he's a dad of a young boy. And I really think that the the kind of thread of dysfunction in our family line, at least on my dad's side, he's my half brother, ended with him because of the work that he's done and the capacity that he has to really be a leader in his family and, be leading by example for his son and the way that he holds his son and is able to express his compassion and love and empathy, and the fact that he's even motivated to learn about parenting. I mean, he's sending me videos all the time, Steiner stuff and other things like that. And in observing him, I know that if he hadn't addressed those issues within himself, he would still be caught within his inner turmoil, and his kid would be the reflection of that, of everything that's unhealed, much like our parents are our greatest teachers or have been in my life. It's like those relationships that play out through karma versus those that play out through dharma. And I think that in my relationships, increasingly, there are more relationships on the side of dharma where we have a shared set of values, a shared mission. This is definitely true of my wife. There's an alignment rather than an attachment, right? And so my relationship with my parents is better than ever. If I had kids, the way that I parent them would be vastly different as the man I am today versus the person I was many years ago that had not adequately addressed the issues of my childhood. So I look at everything as a lineage and artifacts of each little part of each soul's development that didn't get addressed along the way. And I can look at all of the problems my parents had, and I can look at their parents, and if I can go back far enough, I can see it in their parents. And so I think, again, humbly, as someone who doesn't have kids, the very best thing I could imagine one could do would be to really heal everything about themselves and every painful experience that they've ever had, especially having to do with the relationship with their parents. My romantic relationships were extremely problematic, even decades into my own recovery and my own healing path, simply because I hadn't really gotten to those core wounds in relation to my parents. And so I would choose partners who were essentially perfect mirrors of those issues that I had yet to work out.
That's how it works.
They would be a version of my mom or a version of my dad. For most of them were versions of my mom. And I really got in and did a lot of work around that relationship and healing that retroactively and in real time. And I stopped sort of the attractor field between archetypes of my mom was dismantled, and I stopped marrying my mom, so to speak.
That's perfect.
And then had an experience where unknowingly, of course, I didn't realize it at the time, but afterward I had attracted someone that had the exact qualities that I needed to heal with my dad and things that I experienced with him as a kid. So to me, parenting, kind of paying it forward, has a lot to do with working backwards. First.
Yeah,
right?
you got to get to the roots of the programming.
We're good. We're all in all of our relationships, whether it's with our offspring or not, are going to just reflect in us those things that are left unaddressed and unhealed.
Yeah.
And it's also just beautiful to know that if you have a long lineage of hurt people that have hurt you and you've hurt others as a result, that you can actually pattern interrupt that through your own healing to where your mere presence has a healing effect on other people around you, whether they be children or not, right? There aren't festering psychic wounds kind of polluting your relationships. I mean, if I think about if I would have had, a kid 30 years ago, I would have a very damaged adult on my hands right now by default. There's no way that I couldn't have hurt them despite my best intentions.
Well, yeah, yes, I agree. And, I'm a guy that my first son, Paul Jr., was born when I just turned 18.
That's heavy, man.
Yeah, I turned 18 August 24th. He was born September the 10th. And, I've shared enough about my childhood developmental years, you have a good sense of that. But one of the things that I think, now I made a lot of mistakes, it's hard when you're 18 and you're trying to figure out who you are and you have a lot of pressure on you because neither my parents nor hers had any money. So for me, it was, you're either going to lose this child to social services or you got to get your shit together and make it happen. And so I'm the make it happen kind of guy. And I did, but as I was raising my son, one thing that really stood out inside of me was how much disdain I had for violence, punishment that was, resulted in visits to hospitals and bleeding and broken bones and just, scary stuff where I could never relax around my father. I just, you just never knew when you were going to get fucking slapped in the side of the head or have your lips split open and blood pouring out of your face or punched or, so when I became a father, I kind of had an inner mantra: don't hurt your child. Don't. I just knew that I could not do that to my son because I know exactly what it feels like and how much anger and emotion it brings up. And just, I got a clear sense of why my brother became a drug addict. It's like he needed something to numb his pain. And he was a guy that just didn't like team sports. He couldn't get along with people. So, if he couldn't do it his way, he didn't want to be involved. But for me, I just needed someplace. I always gravitated towards wrestling or boxing or somewhere where I could hit somebody because I had to football. Like I love football because I needed to move that pain out of me. But the point I'm making is the trauma actually, where most people don't realize that they're actually traumatizing their children because they're acting it out unconsciously. They're just recapitulating the same programming force. For me, it was just like a constant reminder, like don't ever do that because you know how bad it hurts. And you don't want to have your own child live through that because it could scramble their mind like it almost scrambled mine. And if it wasn't for my mother becoming a yogi, I probably would have committed suicide. And my brother did, and my sister probably would have too, because it was just too intense. But I think that when I look at the issue today as a therapist and having studied these things very deeply, one of the things that I think is, if I track it back to say, okay, where did the breakdown really begin? The breakdown, in my observation, began when we are no longer living in tribal societies. Because in a tribal society, so if you go back to that point in human development, no matter what race of people you're talking about, Norse, Eskimo, Native American, Indian, Chinese, we were always with elders, and there was always a chief. And oftentimes there was there far enough back, the chief was a woman. And the women would get pregnant shortly after they started menstruation. So it wasn't unusual at all for a 13 or a 14-year-old girl to be pregnant. And typically the parents would go out hunting and gathering for the first half of the day, and the parents then left the children with the elders, and the elders were responsible for educating the children and for teaching them the myths of the tribe and for teaching them arts and crafts and hunting and all the things that they would ultimately have to know to understand who they were as a person, what their lineage was, how did they deal with rights and wrongs, transgressions. So you had the oldest, wisest, most experienced people actually educating the children. Then when the parents came back from hunting and gathering, usually it took 3.5 to 4 hours a day for the average tribe to meet their needs. They spent the rest of the time singing, dancing, playing, and just enjoying the companionship of the family or the tribe. And so the point I'm making is that the young parents didn't really do most of the parenting and educating. And so once we lost this connection to our elders, and as our industrialized nations have progressed, elders have actually now become perceived as a pain in the ass, like they're too slow, they're old, where they used to be worshipped because they were, the wisest people in the tribe. And so now we have grandparents that are focused largely on getting a bigger flat screen television and another cruise ship, or winning the lottery, but don't really have much interest in their children at all, or their grandchildren. And we've got parents that don't have any wise elders to really support them and make a container for the kids. And I think that's not only true in my observation, but I think that we should all tear a page out of the playbook and say, okay, one thing we know for sure is it takes a tribe to raise a child. And you could say I live almost a tribal life. I've got 2 wives, and we have, many people that come here, and we've got a chef, you've met her, Sasha, and the kids interact with her. And we've got a gardener and a handyman. The kids interact with him. And we've got instructors coming here all the time. So like the kids have connection to a lot of people, more than a lot of kids probably would. And watching, like comparing my childhood and knowing how most children are raised with one mother and one father, and now we've got so many single mothers in the world, it's unbelievable, who are just working themselves to death. We've got this chance now to say, okay, how can I create more of a tribal situation? One of the most common things I see as a therapist is single mothers that are completely and utterly burnt out. They're often dental hygienists, legal paralegals, lawyers, doctors, nurses, but they're single mothers, and they're trying to be the mother and the father at the same time. And they come to me and their health is just in shambles. And then when I have to try to give them things to do, the most common thing here is, I don't have time to do that. Where am I going to do that? I got to do this, 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 and this. And they don't actually have time to be with or even care for themselves, a lot of these people. And then we've got this problem of men that are in relationships and not wanting to commit and don't have the maturity to work through a relationship and take responsibility for their offspring. When I see my kids with 2 mothers and the joy and the beauty, my kids' mothers are both super intelligent, and I watch what they learn from being with Penny and how she nurtures them, and what they learn from being with Angie and how she nurtures them, and what they learn when they're together, and just the diversity of connection and support they have. And I've said to many of my female patients, you need to create a tribe. I said, I bet you know at least 3 to 5 other mothers in the same predicament you're in, don't you? Yes. Okay, good. If you want to go to the gym twice a week, why don't you see if you can have one of those mothers come over and watch your kids while you go to the gym, and then you send your kids to them for a few hours once or twice a week so you can go to the gym or to the nail salon or to the massage therapist or whatever it is that you need. But I've inspired many people to start rebuilding their own tribe. And I really think that we have got to tear a page out of the tribal playbook, or we're going to be right where we're at now, with most people are completely and utterly exhausted, and 70% of the US population right now cannot meet its core survival expenses without using credit cards. We've got the highest level of credit card debt in the history of credit cards. We're acting just like the government. And I think that we all need to really start bonding together for all the reasons that made you leave LA, that you and I both know about with the pandemic. Anyhow, do you have any thoughts in that regard?
I mean, yeah, you raised so many important points. Humans are going to evolve how they evolve. But and I'm not that knowledgeable of a history buff, I think in sort of broad creative strokes, but to me, agriculture was the nail in the coffin.
Yeah.
I mean, from physical health to the health of the collective, to the rise of the city state, right? You start being sedentary, and now you're able to have livestock and raise food. Now you have resources that need to be protected. Here comes the militia. Then there is the opportunistic, sort of parasitic people that can't create, that come in to start to hoard resources, right? And fast forward that 10, 15,000 years, however long it's been, and it's what we have now. And part of the mechanism of control is disempowering men and negating men. I mean, watch TV per se, like sitcoms or something, but I'm aware of TV shows and movies and things like that. And if you look at how the father figures are portrayed in television shows, right? They're always just a complete idiot. No one respects them.
Yeah.
All of that kind of thing.
The wife's holding the whole thing together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, going back into, it's part of the repercussion of like patriarchal cultures, right? And this boomerang effect where you realize like, wow, men have kind of been assholes. The masculine has been out of balance and women have been abused and subjugated. The feminine has not been revered and cherished through time. So, wow, we need to correct that. Maybe an overcorrection with some of the toxic elements of the women's liberation movement and, getting women out into the workforce after wars and such. And then the men come home and they don't really have a place anymore. They're traumatized from battle.
Yeah.
And now you have both parents out of the house. Who's raising the kids? The television and the public schools, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, the conspiracy theorist in me sees the design in the dissolution of the family, because if you don't have a strong father figure and you don't have a strong family unit for which both parents are willing to die to protect, you've got a population that's very easy to control.
Yeah, and here we are.
Yeah, and so leading into the pandemic, I mean, the trauma-based mind control and the damage that's been done to family systems and specifically to kids through masking and social distancing and all of that, we're really at a turning point right now, to your point, where it's so crucial that we take responsibility for our capacity to build micro communities.
We have to.
And thankfully, I see a lot of that happening.
I do too.
And this is going back to the 60s communes, many of which, failed due to people's lack of understanding of who's going to be the leader and how do they lead, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And the corruption that is prevalent when you start giving certain people power over groups of people. It's very tempting for those that aren't spiritually evolved and acting in integrity. So there's no utopian answer to living on a commune and singing Kumbaya. But I think to your point of building microcultures, just like you're building here on your land, where there is transparency, equanimity, foundational principles that bind groups of small groups of people together.
Values, I think, is critical.
Yeah, recreating family units, and also something you pointed out that's really so sad is the devaluation of elders.
Yes.
Right. I mean, just think about old folks' homes, retirement communities. That our culture in the West, at least, is situated so that we would feel we do treat our elders as a burden rather than a resource as they get older. The idea of like having your mother-in-law move in or your father-in-law move in. Most people probably wouldn't like that idea. They'd rather pay someone else to take care of them rather than having them into the house, living amongst the family, So I think whatever the family unit is, that is the thing that not only breeds future generations that are going to be happy and productive, but it's also really our first defense of the encroachment of the state, right? And that's why they don't like it. That's why they don't like families.
Yeah, we're in a very interesting time right now.
It's a crazy time to be alive, man.
It is a crazy time. It's like Jung, Joseph Campbell, and other experts I've studied all warn that whenever a culture's myth begins to break down, there's a period where isms pop up all over the place, and it's extremely dangerous. And there's always a clash between the existing myth and incoming myths. And right now, we've got some scary incoming myths. We've got scientific materialism. We've got transhumanism. We've got globalism. And with the incoming of these newer myths, which COVID was part of, as you know, you have a backlash, which is almost always going to produce a reversion back to hardcore fundamentalist religious ideologies. And those can be very warring. I mean, look at the history of the Crusades, and, I could go on and on about that. So what you get is this extreme polarization, which is exactly what the globalists are trying to set up. So we're in this melting pot right now. And you look at, I don't know, is it Howe and the other guy that wrote the book on the how the time goes in cycles, and you have periods where, there's this type of event followed by this type of event. I forgot I did a podcast on it, but you see these archetypal patterns, and you see the repeating of history. And, here's a very potent statement. You've probably heard of it before, but the point that I'm leading to here is that Carl Jung spoke a lot about this, and he said this is when wars are very likely to break out, and that's exactly what he saw with the happening of the Second World War. And he, was very concerned about the rise of Nazism and all that for obvious reasons. But somebody once asked Albert Einstein, how do you think the Third World War will be fought? He said, I don't know, but the Fourth World War will be fought with sticks and stones.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we're right walking the frickin' tightrope right now of a third world war with nuclear weapons, and it could throw us back into the fucking dark ages.
To your point, those cycles, right, of left-wing fascism leads to chaos, and then the constraints of right-wing fascism come in and exert more control until that unravels, like historically, at least in recent history, relatively speaking. It seems that's how the cycles go. Meanwhile, the fascism itself, as a kind of a worldwide mind virus, chugs right along.
Just keeps changing clothes.
Yeah, exactly.
It just keeps putting on a different uniform.
Yeah, which I think is a really important thing for us to understand because of our tribal nature. I mean, right now, someone with my perspective, I would be considered like right wing, Meanwhile, I'm sitting here going, I'm the same guy I've always been.
Yeah.
It's just that the left wing of fascism has gotten so extreme that it's pushed me into what's just a normal person who just wants to be left alone, doesn't want to cause any harm. A pretty like basic, fundamental...
Live and let live.
Yeah, exactly. A very simple worldview. But it's that, it's the temptation of the tribalism of picking a side that really surrenders our sovereignty.
It does. And that's what scares me about all the fundamentalist religious ideology. And, we don't need to go through the history of Islam and all that. Jihads and terrorists and Christian fundamentalism is as dangerous as it gets. There's a long history of warring in Buddhism and Hinduism, Hindus and Muslims killing each other. All the fundamentalist religions are ethnocentric by classification, which means my group against your group, straight up. And right now we need the population of the world to realize we all need each other. We need to hold hands. We need to circle the globe, and we got to protect the resources of this planet, because the planet itself is freaking on its last breath and needs CPR. Hi, everybody. I sure hope you're enjoying the podcast. A couple of months ago, Organifi sent me a couple of bags of their new Shilajit gummies to sample, and I was blown away with how great they taste and how much my body loved them. Having used Shilajit paste for many years, I've never been a big fan of the taste of it, but when I tried Organifi's new Shilajit gummies, I was truly impressed. The texture and consistency of the gummies is excellent, and they have just enough natural sweetness to let me feel like I'm getting a lovely, healthy treat for both my mind and my body. Shilajit is a unique, potent mineral paste from the Himalayan mountains. It contains an abundance of trace minerals, antioxidants, organic acids, and nutrient-transporting compounds. It's been known throughout history to help boost vitality and strength. Just pop a couple gummies and chew, or suck on them slowly for a steady release of the delicious, earthly, but slightly sweet natural flavor. Your taste buds will enjoy the delicious treat while your body soaks up the massive amounts of feel-good nutrition. Rich in fulvic acid, humic acid, vitamins, enzymes, bioflavonoids, antioxidants, metabolites, and over 40 trace minerals, Shilajit gummies can help support energy production, support performance and recovery, support healthy muscles, promote collagen synthesis, support healthy hormone levels, increase cellular energy, decrease fatigue, and promote heart health. I absolutely love Organifi's Shilajit gummies and went through 2 bags in no time because my body craved them so much. I reached out to Organifi to get more right away, and I bet you will too. To get your 20% off for Living 4D listeners on your Shilajit gummies, go to Organifi, Organifi.com/CHEK20. On checkout, use the promo code capital C, capital H, capital E, capital K 20. That's Chek 20 on checkout to get your 20% discount on your awesome Shilajit gummies. I honestly love these things. I know you're going to be just amazed with how great they taste and how good they feel. Back to what we were talking about, creating micro communities and micro tribal groupings where we share values, common mission, vision, values, and dream, and recognize the need to raise the kids to be savvy enough to navigate the forces. I mean, look, I'm a 63-year-old man with young kids. And if there's one thing that keeps me getting in the gym every day and eating good, even though the older part of me says, I'd like you to sit around, smoke pot and paint all day. I mean, I'd fucking love that, to be honest. I mean, there's a part of me that just
sounds pretty fun.
Yeah. I mean, listen to some good music, smoke some pot and paint and just kind of let my soul pour itself onto the canvas. I mean, that's, if I just fell to my, the gravity in me, that's where it would take me. I mean, I look over there every day and see all that paint and all them brushes, and I got a closet full of canvases, and I'm like, I'm so fucking ready to retire. But when I look at the world my children are going into, and I look at how lost people are and the stats, I mean, the United States spent $3 trillion managing diabetes alone in 1 year last year. And we got a $1.9 trillion defense budget. It's the most expensive in the world, bar none. And we've got a $3 trillion a year diabetes problem. I mean, this is like common sense shit. I mean, this is like, I've been freaking teaching this stuff for 40 years. It's like, I've never been here. And I'm like, what the fuck? My point is, I got to make sure my kids are grounded in the earth, that they know how to farm, that they know what water is, that they know what food is, that they know how to think for themselves. They know how to solve problems. They know what the difference between a trustworthy and an untrustworthy. Like, think of what, like, you're wanting to be a father, man. I'm telling you, you don't have time to fucking get old, pal. How old are you?
54 in a few days.
Well, I was 54 when Mana came 8 years ago.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, here we go again. This is like, it came as a complete and utter shock to me. I'm like, whoa. I was not planning on this. I was planning on putting it all on the, retiring and smoking pot and painting and here. But, Mana just blew my heart wide open, and I'm like, okay, here we go. But as I look, and I coach a lot of parents with health problems and life problems and relationship problems. So I'm very hip to what's going on. I've coached many and been a therapist to many protege athletes that go to special schools for just hockey players or, up and coming stars, right? So I've seen how fucked up that side of it is too. But I think that the point I'm making is that my kids really made me realize I must be disciplined. I do not have time to get old. I've got to stay on top of the game. I've got to be able to guide these kids. I've got to be able to protect them. I've got to be there as long as I can to educate them with as much as I can educate them and afford to have them educated on. Because if you're not on fucking point with your kids today, you are sending them to hell. And they won't know how to get out of that. I mean, imagine how many people today don't even know how to find water. They don't know how to use a compass. They don't know basic orienteering skills. They don't know, how to tell good information from garbage on the internet. I mean, the list of shit that can trap people today is long. But if you're a parent today, it's time to get your shit together and listen to everything me and Luke are talking about, or your kids have a sentence to a very dark future. And it's going to take a lot of us to wake up, as you know, together, because if we don't get a mass awakening, people are going to fall hook, line, and sinker for all this shit. They're going to think, oh, digital currency, oh, my life's so much easier, click, click. Oh, yeah. But what you don't know is they're using that to totally fucking control every aspect of your life. And the next thing you know, you're a plant in a fucking plantation and you have no idea who's controlling the lights.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm optimistic, right now.
I am too. The COVID's woke a lot of people up.
I mean, that's the thing. When I look at the microcosm of my life and the dark places I've been, if I were to transpose myself back to being 25 years old, being addicted to crack and heroin and being completely lost and suicidal, if you would have asked me on any given day, what is the prognosis for your future, I would have said it was very grim and it was the lowest time in my life. But as a result of having hit bottom, upon bottom, subterranean bottoms that you didn't even know existed, was the catalyst for me in a very earnest and committed way seeking God, and that's just one man's experience of going, okay, there's nothing left. I surrender, I surrender. And I think in the past few years, those of us that are on, a path of awakening, those of us that value freedom and truth and know that we are God, people like you and I, people listening to your podcast, we have an opportunity to change the trajectory of the collective based on the work that we're doing as individuals. It's like that rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing, right? And so I'm tempted sometimes, because I have a platform with my podcast and the book I'm writing, that I get caught in, I need to wake everyone up. What I mean? It's like we're headed over a cliff here. But really what I find is that as I just continue my own awakening, the impact I have is probably much greater than it would be exerting my energy trying to control things that are completely out of my control in terms of, government overreach and the media and censorship and all those things the rebel in me wants to fight against.
I deal with that every day.
It's kind of it's resisting the temptation to try to tear something down, which I don't have the power to tear down, versus focusing my power into building something else within myself and my community. And, it's as cliche as it sounds, being the change I want to see in the world. So when I look at where we are right now, from one lens, it's like, oh, we are doomed. I mean, if you just look at what's going on in the world and what they're doing to our kids, I mean, it's just terrifying. Yet, again, if you would have asked me at 25, how are things going? Horrible. And you could say from one perspective right now in the collective of humanity that it's horrible, that we're doomed to World War III and so on. Yet at the same time, I hope in 5 years, 10 years, 100 years from now, we'll look back and go, man, humanity hit a bottom because the balance of the polarity and the duality in which we exist got too dark. And that darkness tipped the scale to awaken so many sleeping giants. So many people that were just kind of minding their own business and living in the middle ground of, not being conspiracy theorists and not being completely asleep NPCs. There's a large swath of people that were just kind of in the middle. And so many of those have been forced into facing where we really are. And I think there's more of us than we're probably aware of, because many people, because of public judgment and, not wanting to be shamed by the collective of people that are brainwashed into this cult, the COVIDians, whatever, they're quiet about it, right? They don't want to lose their job. They don't want to be censored on social media. So I know from meeting so many people interpersonally, when we talk off microphone and in a private setting, so many people are well aware of these issues that we face. They're just not, situated in a way that makes them want to be vocal about it.
Well, yeah, and the reason I started, when COVID kicked off, I said to the girl, because I've been doing the research to develop Spirit Gym for 10 years, but the day the lockdown started, I said, I've got to get my book series out, and I've got to start this mentorship program. And it the orientation wasn't that I was going to save the world, but it was that I had to give people the tools to heal and develop the faculty of discernment. I think humans have really lost their capacity for effective discernment. They've gotten so far into the world of processed food and pornography and media illusion that they actually are like a leaf blowing in the wind, and they don't really know, what is and isn't food and what is and isn't exercise and what isn't education and what isn't the truth. I mean, most people have no sense of rational. I mean, how rare is common sense today, you know? And so I just said, look, if I'm going to be on this planet, then I'm going to start a grassroots movement, and I'm going to teach as many people as I can how to have an open-minded sense of the realities and the polarities that drive all myths, because the world is a story. And we must understand how story functions, because ultimately the narrative is what controls people, and it's our own narrative that controls us. So Spirit Gym was really built as a system to say, look, you must become conscious of your story. And when you become conscious of your story, you'll have the consciousness to be conscious of all stories, because you'll know what the components of a story are. And then you'll know when someone's trying to control your story, manipulate, edit, or change your story. And you must be the one that has discernment as to what you allow to happen in that regard. And when you reach the heart, you'll realize that your story should be in some way harmonious with and supportive of space for everyone to live their story. And how do we create that containment for each other? Like, you know, if you want to have wild, kinky, weird sex parties and worship the devil, do it on your property, you know, but don't try to drag my kid over there. Right.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, I'm always like, I think the world's big enough for all of us, but it's when one group starts trying to control everybody else and say, you know, you're going to do it this way or else. And that's what the pandemic really, and what really showed us how people with a lot of money can get very dangerously lost. And so I figured it was my job to use my skills to teach people how to think effectively, how to solve problems effectively, and what a real holistic spiritual way of living is. And that's not based on any ideology, but says this is the structure of story. This is the structure of how spirit unfolds itself. And now that you know that, be more conscious of what you're creating. Because whether you're unconscious or not, you're going to live it out. The difference is, if you're conscious, you're making the choice and you accept responsibility for it. And you know, if it causes pain, go stand in the mirror and meet the creator. Otherwise, it's always somebody else's fault, and that never gets you anywhere. You know, you're just constantly passing the buck. It's the victim or the saboteur or the prostitute that are living inside of you, and that never creates a safe environment for children or anybody else.
Yeah, I like that idea of Spirit Gym from the lens of building the muscle of discernment, to be able to discern truth from falsehood.
Yeah.
Right? That requires your heart. And we've been indoctrinated into scientism and into a worship of the intellect. As powerful and beautiful as the intellect can be, we're looking at a society led astray by the intellect, because the intellect is so susceptible to mind control.
Oh, totally.
Right? So it's like in your heart is that feeling you get like, this room feels a little off. There's something off about this person. There's something off about this government mandate. There's something off about the information that I just got from my doctor at the hospital.
Yeah.
Right? It's like without that heart relationship, we're individually lost and collectively lost, because the main fallibility of the human to me is our lack of ability to discern truth from falsehood.
Absolutely.
And we'll believe our own falsehoods and first and foremost, and then that makes us more susceptible to the falsehoods that are imposed from outside of ourselves.
That's exactly what it means to be unconscious.
Yeah.
We could summarize it into that statement you just made.
Yeah.
So Spirit Gym is really about waking up and becoming conscious, especially of the things that you need to be conscious of, so that life doesn't hurt nearly as bad as when you're unconscious.
Yeah.
Well, Luke, I'm going to break the podcast now for and the second part of it will be for the members. But what a great conversation, man. And I'm so grateful that you've been through all the things you've been through and come out the other side, because what a positive influence that you are in the world. I know you've got hundreds of podcasts out there, and, you know, everybody that I know tells me how great your podcast is. I've only heard you speak one time, and the first thought I had was, I got to get this guy on my podcast. And of course, as we talked, your name kept popping up over and over again. I feel like I wished I had had this meeting with you, 25 years ago or something, But, maybe Great Spirit brought us together at this time for reasons that are beyond our awareness. But thank you for all your work and all your great podcasts and all the love you pour into the world. Could you tell the listeners where to find more about you, your work, your podcast, and anything else you want to share?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me. And, I forget who first introduced us, but you've had such a profound influence on so many of my friends and
thank you.
Guests on my podcast. I think it was 2019 or so. I was emailing with Penny and we were going to set something up for me to come down here when I lived in LA.
Yeah.
And then the pandemic happened.
Right.
And it was like, wow, I got to get out of here.
We went into survival mode.
I probably would have been okay down in this area, but it was urgent that I got out of LA. So I'm glad, that the divine timing worked out to put us here together. And thanks for coming and doing my podcast in Austin too. It was lovely. That was a very expansive conversation.
Yeah.
I love, starting a conversation on my podcast and just going right off the deep end. There was no so tell me about your, it's just like, boom, let's go right into the meat of it. So that was really fun. And people can find me. My podcast is called The Life Stylist. And your episode will probably be out by the time this comes out or shortly after.
Cool.
And I've had opportunities to have just amazing conversations with people from all walks of life. I feel like I really gamed the system to be able to make a living doing what I would want to do anyway.
Yeah, I love podcasts.
It's like sitting down, having a chat with Joe Dispenza or David Icke or Bobby Kennedy. I mean, just fascinating, enigmatic human beings that are interesting to me. And so that's something I've been doing for almost 9 years now.
Yeah. And
I can't see a good reason to stop, so I just keep doing it. And then my main website is lukestorey.com, where you can find
Storey, everybody.
Yeah, where people ask me if that's my real name. I say, yes, that's my real name. It's kind of like when you're, if you make shoes and your last name's Shoemaker.
Yes, it's kind of funny.
I listen to stories and I tell stories, and who knew that that's where I was going to end up.
Yeah.
But that, my website is kind of the mothership, and all of the different, physical healing technologies and practices that I have found advantageous are all there, as are all my podcast archives and videos and all those things. And
awesome.
Kind of my philosophy on life and health and everything is there. And then it will be quite a while, because that's how writing books go, as you know. But I'm currently writing a book called A Horse Named Lonesome that will be out in March 2026.
Awesome.
Which is why I extended my stay here. I'm behind on my deadline as usual, so I'm going to spend the next 2 days working on that. And that's really the most meaningful work that I'm doing right now, because it's an opportunity for me to not only share other people's perspective, but specifically my own journey and the things that I've learned along the way.
Yeah. So, fantastic.
I'm excited to codify all of that and kind of finally put it out into the world.
Well, my dream is that this is the beginning of many podcasts between me and you, because we've got enough life experience to have, and enough connections and enough knowledge to have a lot to talk about. And it's an excuse for me to, say, hey, we need to get together. And I'd like to say thank you to my sponsors for the amazing products you guys create and supporting the planet by supporting farmers that are doing good things for the planet. Thank you to all of you for anything you buy from the sponsors. It supports you so you can live and love more fully, supports the planet, and supports the podcast with a small commission that goes to me. So we really appreciate it, so I can take the time out of my schedule to create good podcasts for you. And for those of you that are members, we will continue this conversation with Luke. We still have some very interesting things to talk about. Luke's had a very rich and interesting life. So if you've been enjoying it so far, you can go to paulchek.com. You can get your membership there for about the price of a cup and a half of Starbucks coffee for a month's extended play. So love is a boomerang. You support me, I'll support you. And we're going to squeeze some more out of them before we go. So meet you there. Bye, guys. Lots of love.
Thank you for listening to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek and today's guest, Luke Storey. If you'd like to continue listening to their conversation, you can join Paul's Spirit Gym podcast membership. When you subscribe, you'll get access to exclusive extended episodes of Spirit Gym with Paul Chek, members-only Q&A opportunities with Paul and his guests, access to the podcast members forum within the Spirit Gym community, where you can interact with other passionate listeners, and the chance to purchase exclusive Spirit Gym merchandise. Your support helps keep the show running and allows us to bring you even better content. So if you're ready to dive deeper and unlock all these amazing extras, head over to paulchek.com/podcast and become a Spirit Gym podcast member today. You can visit Luke's website at lukestorey.com. That's LUKESTOREY.com, where you can find out more about Luke, browse his favorite products, and listen to the latest episodes of his podcast, the Lifestylist Podcast. You can connect with Luke on Instagram at Luke Storey, on X and Facebook at Mr. Luke Storey, and on YouTube at Luke Storey. For more of the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast, where you can also find details of the special offers from our premier sponsors, Bioptimizers, Organifi, Paleo Valley, and Wild Pastures, as well as links to Paul's social media, his YouTube channel, and his blog. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and a warm review on the podcast platform of your choice. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, and YouTube.